the tyrant who wrote the rules of freedom. We celebrate them as the architects of liberty, the visionaries who drafted the blueprints for modern freedom. Their words echo through the halls of power. Their ideas inspire revolutions. They're the titans of history, the great men who bent the world to their will and, in doing so, gifted us concepts like equality, justice, and self-determination. We build monuments to them and carve their faces into mountains. But what if the same hands that wrote, "All men are created equal," also held the chains of enslaved people? What if the minds that designed our most cherished legal codes were also responsible for millions of deaths in brutal wars? This is the story of a profound paradox, a disturbing conflict at the very heart of our history. It's not a simple story of heroes and villains. It's the story of the tyrants who wrote the rules of freedom. And it forces us to ask a difficult question. What do we do with a hero who is also a monster? The glorious blueprint. To really feel the weight of this paradox, you first have to appreciate the scale of their achievement. Try to imagine a world defined by divine right, where your lot in life was sealed at birth. A world of kings and emperors, where most of humanity lived and died under the absolute authority of a tiny few. Then a seismic shift begins. A revolutionary idea, born in the cafes and salons of the Enlightenment, starts to spread like wildfire. The idea is simple, but it's powerful enough to topple empires. That power belongs not to the ruler, but to the people. That we all have inherent rights that no government can take away. This wasn't just philosophy, it was a blueprint for a whole new world. And at the forefront of this revolution was a generation of leaders who dared to turn these radical ideas into reality. Among them, few stand as tall as Thomas Jefferson. He was a true polymath, an architect, inventor, diplomat, and philosopher. But his most enduring legacy is etched into the founding document of the United States, the Declaration of Independence. Think about the world-shaking power of its opening lines. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This wasn't just a declaration of war against a king, it was a declaration of war against the entire old world order. It set a new standard for governance, one based on the consent of the governed. Jefferson's words became a rallying cry for freedom fighters around the globe, a promise of a future where dignity wasn't a privilege, but a birthright. Publicly, Jefferson was a fierce opponent of slavery, the very institution that spit in the face of his ideals. He called it a moral depravity and a hideous blot. In 1778, he drafted a Virginia law to ban the importation of enslaved Africans, and in 1784, he proposed banning slavery in the new Northwest Territories. He knew on an intellectual level that slavery was a poison that threatened the survival of the American experiment. He famously described it as holding a wolf by the ear, and we can neither hold him nor safely let him go. This is the Jefferson we choose to remember. The visionary, the architect of liberty. His greatness seems undeniable. But to stop the story here is to ignore the rot at the foundation of his glorious blueprint. The rot at the foundation. Now let's leave the hallowed halls of Philadelphia and travel to the rolling hills of Virginia, to Jefferson's personal estate, Monticello. Here, the philosopher of freedom was a master of men, the man who wrote that all men are created equal, enslaved over 600 human beings during his life. And this wasn't some passive inheritance he was reluctantly managing. Slavery was the engine that powered his entire world. The food he ate, the clothes he wore, the free time he had to read and write and philosophize. It was all made possible by the forced labor of hundreds of people who were denied the very liberty he championed. The work at Monticello was extensive, with enslaved people working as blacksmiths, carpenters, and farmers. their lives meticulously recorded not as citizens but as property in his farm book. The hypocrisy is staggering. Over his entire lifetime, Jefferson officially freed only 2 of the more than 600 people he enslaved. 5 more were freed in his will. Among those who remained enslaved were his own children, from his long relationship with Sally Hemings, an enslaved woman who was also his late wife's half-sister. By Virginia law, his children inherited their mother's status, making the author of the Declaration of Independence the legal owner of his own children. The brutality of the system was always there. While Jefferson might not have used shackles, the regime at Monticello was one of absolute power, enforced by the constant threat of violence, family separation, and the complete denial of human agency. He profited directly from the institution, buying and selling people to manage his debts. So how is this possible? How could the man who wrote that liberty was an unalienable right deny that same right to hundreds of people, including his own family? This is the central paradox that defines not just Jefferson, but so many of history's great figures. He was an architect of freedom who built his world on a bedrock of tyranny. The hypocrisy is so deep that it forces us to look beyond just one man and ask if there's a fundamental conflict between being great and being good. The paradox of power, a wider view. The disturbing truth is, Thomas Jefferson isn't an anomaly. He's a perfect example of a pattern that repeats throughout history. The gap between a leader's celebrated greatness and their personal goodness echoes across empires and eras. Take Napoleon Bonaparte. Here's a man who came from nothing to become the master of Europe. He's often hailed as an enlightened ruler who laid the groundwork for the modern state. His greatest achievement, the Napoleonic Code, was a revolutionary legal framework that promoted equality before the law, property rights, and religious tolerance. It was so influential it's still the basis for civil law in places like France and Quebec. He championed meritocracy, the idea that you should advance based on talent, not birth. A truly radical concept for its time. But this great reformer was also a megalomaniac who dragged Europe through more than a decade of war, leading to an estimated 3.5 to 6 million deaths. He betrayed the revolution's ideals by crowning himself emperor, creating a new aristocracy, and even reinstating slavery in the French colonies. He was a brilliant modernizer and a brutal conqueror, a liberator and a tyrant. His legacy is such a paradox that France is still deeply divided over him today. Or look at Winston Churchill. He is celebrated, and rightly so, as the Bulldog of Britain, the man whose defiance saved his country and maybe the world from Nazi tyranny. His speeches rallied a nation in its darkest hour, and his resolve was essential to the Allied victory. Yet, this icon of freedom was also a die-hard imperialist who believed in the superiority of the Anglo-Saxon race. He held views on race that were extreme, even to some of his own colleagues. His policies contributed to the horrific Bengal famine of 1943, where up to 3 million people in British India starved to death. A catastrophe he partly blamed on the victims for breeding like rabbits. He once argued that no great wrong had been done to the indigenous peoples of America and Australia because a stronger race, a higher-grade race, has come in and taken their place. The man who saved Europe from one racist ideology was himself a champion of another. The list goes on. Alexander the Great spread Greek culture across the known world, but also massacred entire populations. Genghis Khan created one of the largest empires in history and secured the Silk Road, but his campaigns led to widespread slaughter. This pattern challenges the whole idea of the great man theory, the 19th century notion that history is just the story of extraordinary individuals. It makes you wonder, what if the very qualities that allow these figures to achieve greatness, their ambition, their ruthlessness, their willingness to break all the rules, are the same things that make them so morally compromised? What if the road to changing the world is paved with what we would normally call evil? attempting to understand the unthinkable. Trying to make sense of this paradox lands you in one of the hottest debates in history. How do we get inside the heads of these figures? The most common defense is that they were just men of their time. The argument is that it's unfair to judge people in the past by today's moral standards, a bias we call presentism. In Jefferson's era, slavery was a deeply entrenched institution, so holding him to 21st century standards is anachronistic. This view asks for context, for understanding that people are products of their environment. And there's some truth to that. Morals do shift, but the argument only goes so far. It conveniently ignores that even in their own time, these figures faced opposition. The abolitionist movement existed in Jefferson's day. Anti-imperialist voices existed in Churchill's. These weren't universally accepted norms. Jefferson himself knew slavery was wrong. His own writings prove he was aware of the moral failing even while he was committing it. So the man of his time defense can quickly become a get-out-of-jail-free card. A deeper explanation might be psychological in our human capacity for cognitive dissonance. That's the mental stress you feel when you hold two contradictory beliefs. It's possible that men like Jefferson compartmentalized their lives. In one box was Jefferson, the Enlightenment philosopher, the believer in universal liberty. In another was Jefferson, the Virginia planter, whose entire lifestyle depended on slavery. Trying to reconcile the two would have been psychologically shattering. So maybe he just didn't. He lived inside the contradiction, with mental walls keeping his ideals and his actions separate. Finally, you have to consider the corrosive nature of power itself. The quest for greatness often requires a relentless drive for control, for the authority to impose your will on the world. This ambition can blind you to your own hypocrisy. As the Greek philosophers warned, tyranny isn't just a political system, it's a disease of the soul. It's when a ruler thinks they are above the moral codes that bind everyone else. This sounds a lot like what philosophers like Nietzsche wrote about, figures who operate beyond good and evil, creating their own moral rules to justify what they do. In their quest to remake the world, they may see their own injustices as necessary evils, unfortunate but essential steps toward a greater good. In their minds, the greatness of their vision excuses the goodness they sacrifice to achieve it. Judging the past. The modern dilemma. This brings us to the battlefield of today. How should we, in the 21st century, remember these figures? This isn't just an academic debate. It's playing out in our public squares as statues are torn down and buildings are renamed. One side argues that judging the past by modern standards is a mistake. They warn that it's a kind of cultural arrogance that erases the complexities of history. If we start toppling Jefferson's statues for being an enslaver, they ask, where does it end? Do we condemn all the American founders? Do we tear down the pyramids because they were built with forced labor? That path, they argue, leads to a sanitized but false version of how our world was built. On the other side, many argue that some moral truths are timeless. Racism, cruelty, and denying people their basic dignity are just wrong, period. From this viewpoint, ignoring the tyrannical actions of historical figures isn't nuance, it's complicity. It's saying that the achievements of the great matter more than the lives of those they oppressed. This side argues that monuments aren't just history lessons, they're statements of our values. To honor someone with a statue is to celebrate them, and we should be very careful about who our society chooses to celebrate. There's no easy answer. The philosopher Ido Fileva suggests a two-step approach. First, we can evaluate a person based on the best moral standards that were available to them in their own time. But second, we must also judge that historical standard itself against what we now know to be right. So, we can say that Jefferson might have acted within the accepted hypocrisy of his era, but we can and should still judge that era's standard as deeply morally wrong. This lets us hold two ideas at once. We can acknowledge a person's huge historical contributions while also condemning their profound moral failures. It allows for complexity, for a history of gray areas instead of black and white heroes and villains. Conclusion: the lives of these figures reveal a deeply uncomfortable truth. History is built on paradox. The foundations of modern liberty were laid by men who practiced tyranny. The defense of freedom was led by men who held racist beliefs. The line between a hero and a monster is often terrifyingly thin, and sometimes it runs right through the heart of the same person. Grappling with these legacies means we have to reject simple answers and hero worship. It requires us to look at the past with clear eyes, seeing both the monumental achievements and the unforgivable sins. It forces us to see these figures not as gods to be adored or demons to be banished, but as deeply, profoundly, and disturbingly human. So, when we look back at the titans who built our world, what should we see? The genius of their creations or the stain of their sins? And maybe the more important question is, what will future generations see when they look back at us? These paradoxes are at the core of our history. If you want to keep exploring them with us, make sure to subscribe and click the bell icon so you don't miss what's next. We want to know what you think in the comments. Can you separate the art from the artist? Can we admire the blueprint for freedom while condemning the tyranny of its architect? Let's talk about it.